Okay, so in my last video, I talked a lot about consistent problem characters for the majority of the patches throughout the Multiversus Beta. Of the characters I mentioned, all of them were meta-defining, at least for a few patches, with some of them staying near the top of the win rate charts. It makes a lot of sense that you'd see characters like Superman and Arya in 90% of the patch notes, since if a character has a high win rate and is also in a broken state, it's more likely that people are going to get a bad impression of the skills that the game values from its players. After all, no one wants to get ledge camped or hell, even air camped by Superman and be told the age-old toxic positivity of just adapt lol. While I don't think this was entirely the fault of these problem characters, because they were dominant characters for much of the meta, it was much more likely that anyone could run into them and get a bad impression of multiverses as a whole. But what if I told you that this is not just a one-way street? What if I told you that a character can be broken, but not strong? What if this character was purposefully allowed to have the lowest win rate and pick rate for 95% of the beta's lifespan? And just what if the team at Multiversus looked at these stats and decided that he did not need any buffs? You guys read the title of the video and seen the thumbnail already, so it's time to talk about the problem with Steven Universe in Multiverses. Now, while there is a lot to say about this character, and probably only like 5 Steven mains total, I think it's important to get a generalized overview for those who may not know what the character even does. Especially since I've seen people with hundreds of hours in this game still have no clue what he does.
Oh wait, is that my shield? Oh, he has a shield? He's the only character in the game with a shield. I didn't know that. I've never seen them do it.
So to make things clear, I'm going to be separating this into 3 sections. For section 1, I want to cover both his neutral and advantage state, so when he's ideally able to do what he wants to do. Section 2 will be focused on his disadvantage state, or the options he has to help minimize danger when things aren't going his way. And finally, for section 3, what it all means for the character. Stay around afterwards for a sneaky bonus section, where I list some of the potential changes for the character for when the game goes from its beta to its full release. So first, let's go ahead and talk about his neutral and advantage state. If you're a veteran to withstanding the sadism from platform fighting devs like me, the most blatant thing that may stand out to you is Steven's ability to make platforms. I believe it's these very same Vietnam flashbacks that make the Multiversus team, as well as anyone who isn't too familiar with the character, think that the N at the end of Steven's name is just a suggestion. While making platforms and walls is game breaking when there's a diamond tip consequence on the other side, when it's just Steven, there's no incentive to not just let him do his thing. Sure, Steven can wait for his cooldowns to come back, but generally speaking, most of the cast has much more valuable cooldowns that they'd much prefer to wait for anyways, so usually people just wait out the platforms. In teams specifically, Steven's teammates can benefit from the setup time and forced approaches. This is appreciated, but not a unique skill of Steven's, as a teammate's presence alone is usually enough of a metaphorical wall to allow characters to set up. Now, if you're at least a little familiar with Steven, you'll know that he actually does have something he can do. He can use his down special that summons an additional teammate and heals for, wait, 6 health? Okay, so for those of you who are not too familiar with Steven Universe or Multiverses, let it be known that in his show, healing is kinda his thing. And while 6 health seems like a ton if you're more accustomed to Smash, cooldowns in this game keep this move extremely underwhelming, especially when Shaggy can, do this. It used to be an alright way to force approaches, since not only was he getting a heal, even when it was down, you didn't want him to just get that cooldown back for free. But they hard nerfed this by making it so that the minion he summons had to die for the cooldown to even start coming back. While that sounds fair on the surface, this little guy does nothing. It's not even like you could summon multiple of them in the first place, since even before it was nerfed, it wouldn't summon a second watermelon. It would just put another healing field down. The main thing that he does is serve as a moving projectile wall, which can make people a little bit more conservative with their cooldowns. This would be valuable if it wasn't for the fact that Steven already has answers to projectiles in spades. Aside from that, it's more often than not a hindrance to Steven when he's on screen, as all he does is run and dodge around opponents while rarely throwing a slow, stubby, and low damage punch. It's honestly clip-worthy when you get this little guy to do anything aside from lock you out of your heals. You would think that putting Steven Bomb on him would be good because he runs towards your opponents, but usually you want to be the one running in with it anyway to make favorable trades. Having someone else in there who can't capitalize off of trades usually just limits the screen coverage of the bomb. This makes it less than optimal to put the bomb on him. While we're talking about Steven Bomb, it's finally time to give credit where it's due and talk about the good parts of his advantage state. Steven Bomb is possibly the best thing about this character. Whenever it's up, Steven can look to make trades that quickly lead to high damage, a close stock, or a bubbled opponent. Steven has some pretty stubby buttons in comparison to a lot of the cast, but opponents can't risk trying to capitalize off of stuffing his approaches when he's got Steven Bomb on without the threat of a hard-hitting reversal. In general, if Steven can get that first hit, he's got some shockingly high damage and kill power. By hitting an opponent multiple times after Steven lands the explosion, they'll become trapped in a bubble. While you can't hurt someone in the bubble, it gives Steven and his team time to let their cooldowns come back, or even lets them run down another enemy without having to worry about intervention. Steven's combo game is purposefully made quite strong to help synergize with the requirements to bubble someone. Shield Surf is particularly great to start combos, as it's an extremely active hitbox that converts into the Steven combo blender. Okay, so I know I said I was done complaining, but it's important to note when talking about his buttons that his toolkit lacks a consistent way to break armor. He is technically able to like everyone else in the game, but his options for doing so are much less convenient and don't allow for nearly any flexibility. Steven only has one move that naturally breaks armor, and it's slow, stubby, and worst of all, grounded. It being grounded makes it impossible to approach with, and impossible to answer airborne armored opponents. While there is a perk that allows fully charged moves to break armor, Steven only has 2 charge moves. One of them is his wall, which he can't really afford to charge all the way to break armor, and the other is his nair, which takes a full 2.5 seconds to charge enough for the perk to actually work. But while he does struggle against armor, Steven's other greatest strength is the armor of his own, which leads us into disadvantage state. While the idea of disadvantage state in general doesn't seem like a good thing, Steven has a lot of great tools to help him minimize just how bad getting hit can be. Well, kinda. We'll get into that. The best thing about Steven is that he's the only character in the game with a shield. Unlike shielding in Smash, Steven actually suffers no shield stun whatsoever, and also serves as a wall when he shields. So because of this, he's always able to shield and punish opponents' moves without having to worry about them crossing him up. He can also shield in the air, due to his neutral air dodge being swapped with shield. This can lead to some nasty edge guards where he blocks recoveries and then spikes them afterwards. In 2s, it's even better, as anytime he shields, he also shields his teammates, no matter where they are. And while it's not necessarily tied to disadvantage, he can also give armor to his allies with his nair, which can let him and his teammate go in together and run over people with approaches, which is nice since it's not really tied to any sort of cooldown. Needless to say, this opens the floodgates for approaches and disadvantage, right? While the shields are borderline broken when they work, Steven is the only character in the game who can get hard counterpicked at perk selection with the armor breaking perk. Steven's shield is counted as armor and therefore will be broken by charged attacks as well as anything that will actively break armor. If you're unfamiliar with the game, playing around fully charged moves and a very specific subset of armor breaking moves doesn't really sound that bad, but pretty much every character in the game, with the sole exception of Steven, has a strong way of utilizing these moves to run their offense about the same way they would normally.
Unbreakable bond? Yeah, right.
Without his armor, Steven's disadvantage suddenly becomes the worst in the game. Steven has the smallest dodge distance in the entire game, making it nearly impossible to get out of most pressure strings. This also leads to him being one of the easiest characters to edgeguard and touch of death. It certainly doesn't help that he's tied as the 6th lightest character in the game either. Then, you and your Steven main teammate just so happen to run into a character in rank that not only has several high reward armor breaking moves, but is also one of the best advantage state characters in the game who's notorious for touching you once and killing you, so you just gotta sit back and watch your teammate make one mistake as he's getting his hand shook as he's being given an all expenses paid vacation to the blast zone. And would you look at that? You missed his flight, so you just gotta watch him shrug as you see both of your ranks dip down from top 500 in the world to top 2000s in the world. Oh, whoops, sorry. I guess I didn't get all my Superman ranting out of my system in the last video. Where was I? Yeah, he can also do this and that. That's kind of funny. Not great, but funny. What it all means. Steven is a very unique character that has a lot of things that seem to be strong, but are usually just strong on paper and is heavily reliant on your teammate to carry to actually be strong. He's very volatile in the sense that when he works, he feels broken. But when he's hit with a reality check when it doesn't work, he just doesn't function as well as any other character in the game. This isn't helped by the fact that his biggest strengths are countered by standard play. And even when they aren't, a perk choice can easily make it so that they are, which is a weakness no other character has to the same extent. It's understandable why Steven has always been at the bottom of the win and play rate charts, as even small changes provide the character potential to take over the game. Hell, even when Steven was struggling to see success, Player First still went out of their way to nerf Steven to ensure that he'd stay in check. At the same time though, if they leave him as he is now, it's going to be very frustrating to the dedicated mains attempting to play the character whose strengths just don't function and whose weaknesses are glaringly apparent. Steven in his current state just doesn't work outside of very specific circumstances, and this creates a huge design flaw for the character. Now, this final point I want to make is a bit disconnected since it doesn't really have anything to do with Steven himself, but one of the biggest issues that Steven mains face is just, why Steven? For everything that Steven brings to the table, there's just another character that can do that thing better. Heals, as Steven's signature ability in the show, is outshone by every other character with heals. Everyone else is either heals for more or has a lower cooldown because of the watermelon holding him back. In Shaggy's case, sandwiches have no cooldown, heal more, don't require his teammate to stand still, and still serves as a projectile threat. Steven may have a nasty advantage state, but so does most everyone else in the game. And don't even get a Steven main started on Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman, by herself, invalidated any reason you might want to play Steven. Her armor is more versatile, as not only does it cleanse, but it also allows her to move while it's up. She's also better at brawling since she doesn't have to worry about armor on approaches. She's better at handling projectiles due to her method being instant and not tied to a cooldown. And she's one of the heaviest characters in the game with insane reversal potential off stage. There is just no reason to play Steven outside of the enjoyment of the character himself. So in this final section, I would just like to suggest a few non-game developer ideas that I feel could open up Steven and make his standalone kit work just a little bit better. Suggested changes. I'll go ahead and start with the less impactful suggestions first, and then get more ambitious and risky as we progress. Firstly, a big issue that Steven has is that he kinda wants to be in your face and put you into the Steven blender, but lacks a way to both approach and answer armor like the rest of the cast. So I think a modest change would be to make his forward air chargeable. This move was already pretty slow and gave you big reward when it hit, so making it chargeable would give him a reliable way to approach armored opponents, as well as making it a bit easier to time when reflecting projectiles. A bit more of a drastic change would be to change his grounded down special completely. Watermelon is more often than not an inconsistent hindrance to Steven. And while it is kind of cute, it doesn't really do much aside from locking Steven out of his heals. Opponents who know this will actively avoid killing the watermelon just to prevent Steven from healing, while not really facing any consequences. So you could either get rid of the watermelon completely, or buff him to be a bit more of a threat by coding him to dodge around less and attack more. Either should work. Getting into the spicy changes now, one suggestion I have is to make Steven Bomb armor break. As good as Steven Bomb already is, because Steven doesn't really have an answer to armor, one of the easiest ways to shut it down is to armor through it and hit him away. By making it armor break, Steven would actually have a pretty threatening cooldown. People would not want him to get this cooldown back for free, and this would force them to play around his other strength, that being his platform and walls. While it won't really matter in some matchups, it allows Steven to function regardless of the matchup, and decreases his overall volatility, which is something he really needs. And the most drastic change that I can't see them doing in good faith is to make his passive shield actually unbreakable. Obviously, this can open up a huge can of worms, as without being able to break his shields, the character counterplay becomes much less straightforward. That being said though, in its current state, almost the entire roster can ignore what should be his biggest strength with the right perk. Compensational nerfs are also an option though, such as making them come back slower or changing the stacks from 3 to 2. This would also pressure opponents to approach and deal with his platforms, as they would not want to risk Steven getting his shield stacks back. As one final disclaimer, I want to be clear that I do not think Steven needs all of these buffs to function as a character. These are just individual suggestions that I think would help Steven out a little bit in a time where I think he's drowning in the meta as player-first games look the other way. With that though, that wraps up what I consider to be the problem with Steven Universe in Multiverses. Let me know what you guys think. Me and my twos partners Jazz have had extensive time to really pick apart the character, as he's actually Jazz's main. A lot of people don't really know what the character does in general, and there's not really a ton of discussion about him, so I hope this clears things up as well as establish why you may not see a ton of him in the meta. I have a few other content ideas to celebrate Multiversus coming back, as well as shorts releasing every day until the game officially drops. With that said though, I still would really like to hear video suggestions as well from anyone who may not be too familiar with the game. I've put a ton of time in this game, and honestly, I have a lot to say, so I'm gonna go ahead and start scripting the next idea. And yeah, that's a wrap. See you guys in the next video.